Thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. And if you want to support Future Hindsight in 2025, join the Civics Club on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/futurehindsight now. And speaking of 2025, don't forget to pick up your very own Future Hindsight desk calendar. It's small, stylish, and will keep you on your toes to be the spark all through the year. You can grab one for yourself or loved one at futurehindsight.com/shop. All right, let's get to the episode. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm your host, Mila Atmos. I'm a global citizen based in New York City, and I'm deeply curious about the way our society works. So each week I bring you conversations to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to build a brighter future together. After all, democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. We know that with the new administration coming in, many of our rights are at risk. Rights that range from abortion to voting. And to prepare us for what's to come, we need a reminder of what our rights are and what we should do when they come under attack. Our guest is Monica Hopkins. She's the executive director of the ACLU of the District of Columbia, where she has been at the helm since 2014. Welcome, Monica. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought we would start with the basics because there are a lot of misconceptions about who the ACLU is. And I think it would ground our conversation today by sharing what exactly is the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and what do you do?
So the American Civil Liberties Union is a nonpartisan organization that protects, defends, and advances the individual liberties and rights, so civil liberties and civil rights, contained within the Constitution and Bill of Rights. So we are not a government agency. We are an independent nonprofit, and we do our work through litigation. We do our work through policy, and we also educate the public about our rights.
So more specifically, what is the work of the ACLU D.C. affiliate?
So much like any other ACLU affiliate, we do those same three things. So we litigate, we engage in the legislative process, and do public education. Here in D.C., we work with the D.C. Council and our court system. We are also a little bit different because the D.C. and the way D.C. runs is we have limited self-governance. So we also sort of watch what Congress is doing and how it would affect the residents of D.C. because of congressional oversight and interference in D.C.'s limited self-governance.
Yeah, D.C. is definitely unique, and I want to get to that later in our conversation. But let's go over what you said about having public education about our rights. And I mentioned in the intro, of course, that a lot of our rights are at risk under a Trump 2.0 administration. You have a very accessible Know Your Rights resource on your website. Super informative, I thought, especially on demonstrations, immigrants' rights and law enforcement, federal employee speech, which is very specific to D.C., and First Amendment. So let's talk about Schedule F first, since your work is in D.C., which encompasses a lot of federal workers. We know, of course, that Trump will demand loyalty from all federal workers, and whistleblowers definitely will not be tolerated. So if you're a federal worker, what do you need to know?
As we talk about Schedule F, I think it's important to take a step back. Trump has sort of given us some mixed signals about whether or not his administration would prosecute people within the government for their views or fire them for those views. And obviously, as the ACLU, we have some First Amendment concerns about retaliatory prosecution or revenge. And that applies in this context to Schedule F and the moving of government workers out of the protected civil service into this new category. The Trump administration in this move could view federal employees as the quote unquote enemy. And there is a concern, and the ACLU has a concern, that they would go after these employees for these unconstitutional reasons. And it would mean transformation of the federal workforce. You know, there are guardrails in place existing that these federal workers do have protections in place for their due process rights. And so right now, there are existing rights, but this is a concern, and it is something, especially here in D.C., that our affiliate is looking at.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to pivot slightly because it's not the same, but it's definitely similar. When we're thinking about whistleblowers, for example, I'm thinking about that there will definitely be protests against the incoming president and his policies into the future, no question. So let's talk about defending First Amendment rights, specifically if you are a protester. What do you need to know? How can you safely practice your freedom of speech and freedom of assembly?
So the best thing people can do is actually know what your rights are. And so you referenced our Know Your Rights guide here in the District of Columbia, our demonstration guide. And that demonstration guide goes through what you should know, not only about your rights, but also what you should know about encountering law enforcement. So here in the District of Columbia, we have multiple law enforcement agencies, and we also have this intersection between sort of federal law and federal property versus municipal property that is governed by D.C. and the law enforcement agency of the Metropolitan Police Department. And so that guide really shows folks how to identify those different law enforcement agencies. So what people should know is you have a First Amendment right to assemble. You have a First Amendment right to raise your voice. And you have a First Amendment right to do so on public property and not have that right interfered with.
So I feel like I'm getting really deep into the wool here, but I don't get to speak to someone at the ACLU every day. So, so what happens if you are arrested for protesting? What do you need to know? And you just mentioned that there are different kinds of law enforcement, specifically in D.C. I don't want you to talk about how this is in other jurisdictions or in other areas, because, of course, a lot of people go to D.C. to participate in a protest. So what should I be looking out for? What's the difference between arrested by one law enforcement agency and another?
So regardless of what law enforcement agency you might be arrested by, your rights are still the same. So here in the District of Columbia, it is important to identify which law enforcement agency, because one of the things we tell folks is when you are on the street, when you are protesting or exercising your rights, at that time, if you get arrested for any reason, that is not the time in which you should debate or argue or anything like that. Ask why you are being detained or why you are being arrested, and ask, are you free to go? Those are really important questions to be asking. And part of not arguing on the street about whether or not you can or cannot be arrested in that moment is really important to not escalate the situation. And so those are sort of things that we advise people. Now, if people are arrested in the District of Columbia, you may be held and detained for a period of time, and you may be what is called no papered and released, or you may have a citation and then go to either Superior Court here in the District of Columbia, or you may have federal charges. And folks probably do not know that the prosecutor in the District of Columbia for some crimes is actually the U.S. attorney. So in other jurisdictions, you may have a state prosecutors, but here in the District of Columbia, if crimes that carry a felony, you will be prosecuted by the U.S. attorney, which is substantially different.
Yeah, that really is substantially different. You know, I listened to your conversation on the ACLU podcast after the insurrection on January 6th, and you talked about the police and the National Guard. And until I listened to that conversation, actually, I had not fully understood why calling the National Guard in D.C. was necessary. It was always like, oh, they called the National Guard in the end, you know, it took so long. But I was always like, but why did they call the National Guard? So, well, it's unique to D.C., and you mentioned in that context of that conversation that this is one of many reasons why D.C. needs statehood. Tell us about why the District of Columbia needs to become a state.
So there are about 700,000 residents of the District of Columbia. And the District of Columbia is more than just the mall and the monuments. We live in our communities exactly like any other state. So we have schools and we pay taxes and we work. And imagine being a resident of the District of Columbia and yet having no voice in Congress. We do not have full representation. And that filters down to our laws here in the District of Columbia, where we have limited self-governance. There are very real reasons that statehood would give us full representation and full states' rights that we don't currently have. So when we need to call out the National Guard, our mayor, who acts essentially like a governor, cannot do that like any other state. We rely on the president to do that, and folks saw that during the insurrection. Additionally, the president has the authority to militarize our police for a 48-hour period. Congress can also intervene in the affairs of the District of Columbia, unlike any other state. So they can intervene and tell us how we can or cannot spend the tax dollars that are collected from district residents and fund our budget. They can legislate directly on the residents of the District of Columbia. And when the D.C. Council passes laws like any other state legislature, Congress can actually enact disapproval resolutions overturning our laws, which is really interesting to think about. If you are a resident of a state, say, like Idaho, and your state legislature passes laws and your governor approves and they are enacted, that would be like another state, like, say, New York, coming into Idaho and saying, well, we don't want you to spend money on the implementation of this law, or we're going to overturn this law, or we are going to pass a different law that you're going to have to abide by. And that is really awkward to think about in a democracy such as ours. And so the way through all of these issues is by passing D.C. statehood and ensuring that we have the rights of every other jurisdiction in this country.
Right. So how often does this happen, that Congress acts in this way? And How closely is Congress really paying attention to the laws that the district is passing?
So once our laws are passed, and I call this the civics lesson inside the civics lesson.
Yeah, I'm curious because, if you're not in D.C., you really don't know. And it's, you hear, oh, D.C. should become a state. Yeah, that makes sense. But people don't really know why. So it's great for us to find out.
So if we go back to our high school years and look at the legislative process, and just to shortcut this, but basically if laws go through, the House and the Senate, and then it goes to the governor, and then it is either enacted or not, if you follow that process, D.C. has an additional process on top of that, which is called the congressional review period. So we pass these laws, and then they go to Congress. And our laws have a 30-day review period with Congress. And then if it's a criminal bill, a criminal justice bill, public safety bill, it has a 60-day review period. And during that review period, Congress can do one of the three things that I talked about. They can file it, what is known as a disapproval resolution, to overturn that law. And then they also can have the other standbys of direct legislation or the appropriations. But focusing on your question of how closely do they pay attention to these, for the first time in the over 50 years that D.C. has had limited self-governance, we saw Congress actually enact 2 disapproval resolutions in this last session. One on our revised criminal code, which was a 16-year process to update our criminal code for consistency and in line with the model penal code that the majority of states have already. And then also a disapproval resolution attempting to overturn our police accountability bill. They did overturn our criminal code, so we were not able to enact this criminal code reform, but they did not overturn our police accountability bill. And in this last congressional session, there were about a little over 90 different attempts to intervene in one of those 3 ways. So they're paying attention.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's really fascinating. I don't really know why they don't want to upgrade is the wrong word, why they don't want to, be in line with other states. That makes no sense to me.
Well, and it's really, if you look at the history of D.C., Congress actually, when D.C. got home rule, which is the act that allows D.C. to elect our own city council and pass our laws and raise taxes and spend them, when that went into place all those years ago, Congress actually had control over this criminal code, and they actually delegated that authority to D.C. over 50 years ago because they said this is too big of a project.
Yes. Why would we want to get our hands dirty in this way? They have enough problems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it was just such an interesting process that they would want D.C. to continue using this code that essentially hasn't been updated since the 1800s. It's just been sort of built upon and not really standardized.
Right. That's wild. We'll be right back with Monica Hopkins, so stay with us. Make sure you don't miss this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, it's a new year, 2025, and you're thinking, how am I going to make this year different? How am I going to build something for myself? Maybe you're dying to be your own boss or see if you can turn that business idea you've been kicking around into reality. But you just don't know how to make it happen. Well, Shopify is how you're going to make it happen. And let me tell you how. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. And with a new year here, the best time to start your new business is right now. Get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. No coding or design skills required. All you need to know how to do is drag and drop. Shopify's powerful social media tools let you connect all your channels and create shoppable posts that help you sell everywhere people scroll. Shopify makes it easy to manage your growing business. How? Well, they help with the nook and cranny details like shipping, taxes, and payments, all from one single dashboard, allowing you to focus on the important stuff like growing your business. But what happens if you don't act now? Will you regret it? What if someone beats you to the idea? Don't kick yourself when you hear this again next year. Make this year the year. With Shopify, your first sale is closer than you think. And remember, you're not alone. No matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. And that's what I love about Shopify. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/hopeful to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/hopeful. And now, let's return to my conversation with Monica Hopkins. Well, let's talk about rights at large in the United States. In your mind, what is the right that is most at risk in the new administration? Like, what's a right that's most vulnerable to attack?
That's a really great question. I think all of our rights are at risk because we really want to adhere to the rule of law. And that seems to be some of the things that cause a lot of concern. Because when we're talking about things like the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, has talked about like mass deportations or the use of militarization against protesters or national abortion ban, all of these things that we're talking about, Schedule F that we just talked about. Our guardrails are essentially the institutions and things that we have put in place and the rule of law that exists through the separations of power, through our judiciary. And so when we talk about like what rights are at risk, that is sort of the underpinning that, we need to ensure that our institutions sort of stay in place. So it's a good question. It's sort of hard for me to unravel it from there.
It's a big question. You're right. I mean, I don't know if our institutions will stay in place, honestly, because the Trump administration will surely embark on a project of ungoverning, which is arbitrary and super chaotic. So actually, I don't know whether some institution might stand simply because they didn't quite get to it and they were just too disorganized. It's a little bit more like a bull in a china shop without really a strategy of what they want to achieve. But you mentioned a few things just now in your answer. One of them was protesters. You talked about mass deportation. And I want to turn back to protesters here because you have a case on speech. You currently have a case before the court on speech, Arab Student Union of Jackson Reed High School versus the District of Columbia, which is challenging the suppression of pro-Palestinian student speech. Trump has already said that he wants to crack down on pro-Palestinian protests. Talk to us about that case and what it portends.
So this is a case, a First Amendment case, a students' rights case, where students at Jackson Reed High School wanted to show a film, a pro-Palestinian film, at their school, and the administration moved to shut it down and curtailed the students' speech. So the ACLU, on behalf of these students and the Arab Student Club at Jackson Reed, intervened, and the students were able to show this film. The underpinning of sort of the legal argument and the underpinning of these First Amendment free speech cases is that the government has a right to enact time, place, and manner restrictions, but they do not have a right to enact restrictions on the content of people's speech. And so in this case, the content of the speech, pro-Palestinian film, is what the administration wanted to shut down. And so when we're talking about shutting down protest under a Trump administration, that is our concern. That is the First Amendment concern. It is not the government enacting sort of like time, place, manner restrictions. It really is the Trump administration not wanting people to raise their voices against a Trump administration, which would be content, or to shut down the pro-Palestinian protests, which would be content again. And so this case on behalf of the students at Jackson Reed has that same sort of legal underpinning and is emblematic of what we might see to come.
Yeah. Well, the other big thing, of course, is mass deportations, which you already mentioned. How are you getting ready for immigration cases at ACLU D.C? I don't know how many immigrants you see there, but before we talk about that, I actually want to know, what are immigrant rights? I have a feeling, I am assuming that they must be slim to none, but actually, I don't know. If you're an immigrant, what should you do if you're confronted with law enforcement? And how, if you are confronted with law enforcement, at what point does the ACLU get involved? Or if it does, I don't know how that would work.
So I want to make a distinction between immigration and immigrants' rights, because I think there is an intersection here. When we talk about individual immigration cases, there is some complexity. But immigrants' rights, there are certain rights that folks do have. And we look at, does the government have the right to move, to detain and deport individuals? Yes, they do, but they have to do so under the rule of law. They cannot do so in darkness. And so really, where are those intersections of how the government will engage in some of these things? I'm thinking about all of the different sort of ways in which we see immigration and immigrants' rights. And so, and some of the things that we are seeing, because if you think about the lives that we live, right, you have immigrants who are going to work. You have immigrants who are in school systems. You have immigrants who are living just their daily lives.
Right.
And so thinking through the ways that, do ICE officials have a right to go into schools? Right?
Yeah.
Do ICE officials have a right to just go into workplaces and start questioning workforces?
Right. I mean, I think they have been doing raids in all the years that I've lived in this country, right? Like they go into, I don't know, slaughterhouses, chicken packaging plants, things like this, and round up people. And I think in my mind, what's really dangerous there is that there are people who are immigrants, maybe that they came a long time ago and their papers are in order, but they're going to get rounded up anyway. And they're going to get all lumped in as one in a way that is obviously the people who, let's say, don't have papers. And by the way, lots of American companies, of course, hire people with no papers and look the other way. So I think this is also not properly discussed when you see reporting in the media, that it's as if people who are undocumented are all bad. But in fact, a lot of American industry relies exactly on these people to perform labor at very low rates, below minimum wage, and they don't mind abusing and exploiting this labor. But so when I say immigrant rights, I feel like who has more rights? Obviously, the person who's undocumented basically has no rights if you come here. But there are people who have temporary work visas for picking fruit, let's say, during the season. Or I know that in ski resorts, you have seasonal workers on temporary visas. And then there are people with green cards. There are all sorts of legal papers that should confer some rights to those people. And I was just wondering how extensive those rights are, or whether they're like, well, whatever, we'll just deport you now.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about immigrants' rights, you said something very interesting, which is, folks don't have certain rights. I mean, if you are in this country, you have rights that are outlined in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. And so even if we think about immigrants' rights, you still have certain rights to due process.
Mm-hmm. That's important to know. I asked Monica this question before the Lake and Riley Act was passed by Congress. It's notably the first act of the 119th Congress to pass. This bill requires federal immigration enforcement to detain and potentially deport any unauthorized immigrant accused of minor crimes like petty theft or shoplifting. So this is very different from the previous policy, which requires not one, but two or more convictions, so not accusations, of crimes of moral turpitude to trigger deportation proceedings. So this is very much not the right to due process, and we've decided to keep Monica's full original answer that follows here for the record, even though it's no longer the same.
Yeah, you still have these rights. Now, the legal processes may look different, but that overarching right to due process remains the same. The same rights when, we saw detention of immigrants in, we'll just call it Trump 1.0, some of the conditions of confinement and the rights under the Eighth Amendment that protects us from cruel and unusual punishment are still rights that everyone in this country has, regardless of status.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a good reminder.
Yeah, and I think there's this dichotomy that people think about when we think about immigrants is that, they're good immigrants and they're bad immigrants.
Yes,
it's
like a fairy tale.
And right. And, our immigration system, is somewhat broken.
Mm-hmm.
And Congress has been trying for years to sort of what needs to be fixed. And so it's not that you just have undocumented workers or documented workers. You also have immigrants who are caught in the system as well, who may have had things expire and are waiting for updates. It is a very complicated thing. And so I think that's why these rights are so important, that we understand individuals within this country, regardless of status, do have rights under our Constitution and Bill of Rights.
Thank you. You also do issue advocacy. And of course, this conversation would not be complete without this issue, abortion rights. Abortion was on the ballot in a lot of states. How did it do on Election Day? And what does that mean for your ongoing work at the ACLU?
So Election Day was a very interesting day for abortion rights in this country. There were several ballot measures in several different states. So you have Missouri actually enshrined abortion rights in their constitution. So did Montana. So did Arizona. So it's an interesting time in which there were referendums on this issue. The ACLU has long advocated on this issue that it is a protected right, an individual's right to privacy. It is also a right of bodily autonomy. And what we are seeing now in state legislatures are additional curtailments and actually criminalization of individuals for interstate travel to seek abortions. And so we will continue fighting both at the local level, at state legislatures, and additionally in Congress to ensure that that right is not only protected, but that we actually advance that right to ensure that it is codified in ways like these ballot measures, but also push on the national level as well.
Right. So, of course, Trump has said exactly the opposite, that he would try to enact a national abortion ban. And if that succeeds, what does that mean for the state laws in blue states where abortion rights are protected?
Well, this is the beauty of the guardrails that are in place for our democracy. This is something that would have to go through Congress. And I've heard folks say, oh, there's, a trifecta right now and that these things will just go in place. Well, the president and Congress have long disagreed on issues. And so it is a little bit harder for a president to just say, I'm going to enact this. That is not necessarily a power that the president has. And these referendum and in the last election, there were some pretty resounding messages that were given to congressional members who were elected in those jurisdictions and in other jurisdictions about how constituencies feel about the issue of abortion and having the right to abortion. And we think that'll be taken very, very seriously. It's not something the president can just sort of override.
Well, that makes me a little bit hopeful. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights that you've shared with us today into action?
I think one of the ways to turn insight into action is, I'll give you two.
Okay.
One is on our website, ACLU D.C. We have provided folks with a way to talk to your friends and family about D.C. statehood. It's not something a lot of people understand, but we should, and we've provided that for you. The other way is we understand the next 2 years, the next 4 years are going to be long. And so I think it's really important that we continue knowing what our rights are and speaking up because it makes a difference. And we have seen that in the past with issues like family separation, where folks rose up and they talked about it and that public opinion mattered. So it's really important that we remember that and engage.
Thank you. So it feels like we are in a perilous moment in democracy right now, but I do think that there is an opportunity from here on out for all Americans to band together and make a brighter future together. So looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
First, despair is not a strategy.
Yes, I agree.
And it's easy to despair, especially when we have seen what could happen, what had happened in the Trump 1.0. But what gives me hope is I had a friend who told me, okay, take out your phone and look through your photos from 2016 to 2020. And what happened? Look at all the ways we engaged, that we came together. Look at what really matters to us and our family and our friends and the joy that we had. And what gives me hope is I know that that can happen again and that it will happen again because it's not just sort of, oh, our lives are going to go on. The government and who we elect and the president affect every single aspect of our life. And we learned that the first time around. And for us to walk away and not engage means that it could look very different when we look through those pictures between 2025 and 2029.
That is indeed very hopeful. It's important to remember that not only do our everyday lives continue, but whatever it is that we do matters on the local and the national level. And if we are involved, it makes all the difference. So thank you very much, Monica, for joining us on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
It was so great to have this conversation.
Monica Hopkins is the executive director of the ACLU of the District of Columbia. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. 2025 is here. The coming years might be long, but don't rely on despair as a strategy. Let's make sure we know our rights and walk into the future as informed and empowered citizens. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Ezra Levin. He's the co-founder and co-executive director of Indivisible, a grassroots movement of thousands of local groups with a mission to elect progressive leaders, rebuild our democracy, and defeat the Trump agenda. That's next week on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app. I know you see the button. Yep, right there. This way, we'll be in your rotation every week. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.